This is the Befuddlement Draught, written by Yellowmarshmallow and read by Lalaspodfics. Summary. These plants are most efficacious and inflaming of the brain, and are therefore much used in confusing and befuddlement draughts, where the wizard is desirous of producing hot-headedness and recklessness. Harry didn't mean to shout about the Dursleys to the entire class, but he didn't expect Malfoy, of all people, to be concerned about him afterwards. Chapter 1. The snow was yet to melt over the grounds of Hogwarts, dampening everyone's post-Christmas mood, which no one thought could get any lower with the return of Umbridge's defense lessons. No one was seen in the corridors without a hat and scarf, and friend groups huddled in front of any available heat source. Fred and George had tried to lift people's spirits with an impromptu snowball fight that almost got the entire school involved, but Professor McGonagall swiftly put an end to it when Lee and Fred created a snow cannon that George then levitated around the battlefield, hitting all the unsuspecting students with a blizzard of snowballs. She said it was due to safety concerns, but Harry suspected she didn't want to give Umbridge an excuse to expel them. Despite the snow, Harry wished he could fly around on his firebolt, but as it was under lock and key, that wasn't possible. He didn't regret punching Cassius Warrington. In fact, he hoped he had broken Warrington's nose. And he knew Fred and George didn't either, but that didn't mean he didn't want to play Quidditch. Flying had always been a way to calm his nerves or clear his head, and now he had this insatiable burning itch in the back of his mind. He wanted to hear the whistle of the wind, feel the tingling sting on his face as he raced through the sky.
"Merlin, it's bloody cold,"
Ron complained as the trio made their way into the dungeons to the potions classroom.
"I'm glad we only have potions down here," he said, rubbing his hands together to keep warm.
Harry nodded, shivering at the lack of heat. He wished he could skip potions and curl up in front of the fire in the Gryffindor common room. As much as he hated Snape and the cold, Hermione would have his head if he even voiced that he was genuinely considering skipping a class during the year of their OWLs. "Can't wait to not only be cold, but have to deal with Snape for 2 hours," Harry grumbled, already in a foul mood due to Umbridge's lesson previously.
"It's the worst,"
Ron agreed, catching Harry's foul mood as if it were contagious. Hermione shook her head at the two boys. "Honestly, you two are useless," she muttered, pulling her wand out of her robes. "Velemon convalesco," she said, pointing her wand at the two. Harry instantly felt a warmth spread through his body and sighed in relief. Ron had a similar reaction.
"Bless you, Hermione,"
Ron smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. Hermione rolled her eyes, her face heating up. "Well, if either of you paid attention in Charms, you'd realize we learnt that warming spell last Tuesday," she scolded.
"I was paying attention,"
Ron insisted, making Harry raise an eyebrow at his friend. Harry remembered that lesson, and he knew neither of them were listening to Professor Flitwick, but rather they were talking about plans for the DA.
"I was, but Hermione, not everyone masters a spell that quickly. You're just bloody smart."
Harry left the two squabbling as his mind drifted again, this time to Sirius. Over the Christmas break, Sirius had spoken to Harry about the Ministry's involvement at Hogwarts. He was concerned about the lack of secrecy their letters held, and how dangerous it would be if someone were to intercept these letters. Harry had no doubt that the Ministry would gladly invade students' privacy by reading their letters, but he wondered if Sirius was spending too much time around Moody, screaming about constant vigilance. Either way, they had decided that anything important would be discussed via the mirror, and pseudonyms would be used when writing letters, just in case. Once they reached the door to the potions classroom, Harry noticed that everyone was huddled together to keep warm, and he bit back a smile when Hermione muttered about how everyone learnt the same spell. However, Harry saw that Malfoy was standing apart from everyone else, looking unfazed by the temperature of the corridor, most likely because he too used the spell to keep warm. Harry scowled at how unbothered Malfoy looked. He didn't know why, but seeing Malfoy leaning against the wall with a grace only ever presented by Malfoy himself made Harry unreasonably angry. As much as Harry didn't want to admit it, Malfoy looked annoyingly handsome. Harry cursed at himself for even letting that thought into his mind.
"Do you think Snape's going to be in a bad or awful mood today?"
Ron asked Harry with a nudge. forcing him to look away from Malfoy. Harry shrugged. Either way, it's going to be torture, Harry sighed with a smile. At least we sit next to each other, he grinned at Ron, who grinned back.
We'll fail potions together, mate, he confirmed with a nod, and the two chuckled. Hermione looked mortified.
Neither of you will fail potions, she shook her head. I will force you to revise until you pass.
Come on, Hermione. I'm practically a lost cause,
Ron groaned, making Harry bite back a laugh. It was true. Ron's worst subject at the moment was potions, which was saying something with Umbridge as the defense teacher. Well, maybe you should actually put in the effort, Hermione suggested with a small smile.
It's not my fault Snape's a vile, evil git,
Ron muttered. And this time, Harry couldn't resist the urge to laugh, making Hermione glare at the both of them. Thankfully for Ron, the door opened after his comment about Snape and everyone flooded into the room. There was an unheard groan when the classroom was somehow colder than the corridor, and despite Hermione's warming charm, he could still feel the change in temperature. They took their usual seat at the back of the classroom and began to set up the basics. The dread that Harry had been feeling all day was at its peak. They were going to be brewing a Befuddlement Draught, a potion that makes the drinker reckless and hostile, and knowing Snape, Harry would at some point be forced to try one of the potions. He wasn't looking forward to seeing just how reckless this potion made you. What if you mentioned Sirius, or the DA? He hoped it wasn't going to be as bad as he was imagining. Snape's cloak swept across the floor as he turned to face the class. If your befuddlement draught appears to be correct, you will test this draught on either yourself or a fellow classmate, Snape said, his eyes lingering on Harry for longer than he liked. Follow the directions exactly. Any deviation will be an automatic fail. Harry sighed, knowing that Snape would find a way to fail his potion no matter what it looked like, even if he followed the directions exactly. Even so, he spent the lesson trying to drown out Snape's snide commentary about his skills in potions. Mr. Potter, you need to fine-grind the sneeze-wort, he sneered, glancing at what he was doing. Harry opened his mouth to reply, but Ron stamped on his foot and shook his head, waiting until Snape had passed before leaning over to Harry.
It's not worth it, mate. You've already got months of detention with Umbridge. We can't have you missing DA, Ron whispered, shooting Harry a small smile. If you could do it without getting detention, I'd let you hex him, he added, making Harry smile back. Ron was right, so Harry held his tongue for the onslaught of comments Snape made, clearly trying to rile him up at this point. However, by the time he had brewed his potion, Harry could not only taste blood from biting the inside of his cheek, but he most definitely had a bruised foot from the amount of times Ron had to remind Harry not to give Snape the satisfaction of a reply. Surprisingly, Malfoy hadn't joined in on Snape's commentary, which only put Harry on edge. He had glanced over at Malfoy a few times out of curiosity, expecting that the lack of snide comments was due to silent death stares. But he saw that Malfoy looked almost bored with the lesson, and he was just staring at his own potion as it boiled, as if expecting something miraculous to appear. When Snape appeared to judge his potion, Harry shouldn't have been surprised when Snape's nose upturned and he cleared the cauldron without any further inspection. It seems that even celebrities can't tell the difference between scurvy grass and sneezewort, he sneered, a smirk appearing on his face, making Harry's stomach drop. Perhaps you mistook them on purpose, Mr. Potter, to avoid testing the potion. After all, it's a rudimentary mistake, Snape continued, earning a few snickers from the other side of the classroom where the Slytherins resided. You can test Miss Granger's potion after a blatant attempt to avoid it. Harry glared at Snape, wanting to tell him where he can shove his comments, but Ron stomped on his foot yet again. Don't,
Ron hissed, knowing that if Harry wasn't careful, he wouldn't have any time for the DA and his schoolwork. Snape headed over to Ron's potion and sneered. 10 points from Gryffindor, Mr. Weasley. It's clear you never even read the instructions on the board, Snape said, barely even glancing in Ron's cauldron before emptying it. It was now Harry's turn to stomp on Ron's foot. Muttering a string of angry curse words, Ron began cleaning his cauldron as Hermione shot Harry a sympathetic look.
Harry knew he had nothing to worry about when it came to Hermione's potion skills, so at least he wasn't going to be poisoned. Only 8 people, including Hermione, made a potion that Snape deemed worthy enough of testing. Each person brought a phial of their potion up to the front and drank its contents, before having to explain the sensations caused by the potion. Probably wanting to prolong his suffering, Snape had decided that Harry would be the last person to test a potion. Before Harry had to try Hermione's potion, Malfoy tested his own potion, which only made Harry more anxious, as Malfoy explained what the potion felt like. He described it as being as if his mind was disconnected from his actions. The idea of having no control over his actions worsened Harry's fears. When it was Harry's turn, he stretched his hands and took a deep breath before Hermione passed him the phial. As soon as he was at the front of the classroom, Harry downed the potion, which tasted like burnt toast, and was pleasantly surprised when nothing happened. Then he wondered what it was that everyone else had felt after taking the potion. "Well, Mr. Potter?" Snape said. "I don't feel any different," Harry said, trying to figure out if he just hadn't noticed a difference. "Well, then, being reckless just must be second nature to you, Potter," Snape commented with a smirk. A few sniggers were heard throughout the room. "Perhaps this is what happens when you grow up a celebrity, being waited on hand and foot." This was when something in Harry snapped. He suddenly felt all his anger and exhaustion at trying to peacefully deal with Snape for the past hour and a half resurface. "You're right, Professor. I'm spoiled rotten," he snapped. "It's really generous of the Dursleys to let me have an entire cupboard under the stairs to myself to sleep in. Next thing you'll know, I'll be making ridiculous requests like being allowed to eat every day or have clothes that fit," he snarled, his breathing shallow as his anger swelled inside of him like a balloon. "Really fucking pampered," he said, glaring at Snape, who looked caught off guard, as if he wanted the man to explode. There was a sudden bang of glass shattering, which snapped him back into reality. Harry realized what he'd just said, and that he'd told not only Snape, but the entire class. He noticed that everyone, including the Slytherins, was staring at him with a mixture of shock and concern. Ron was standing as if he was ready to pounce, prepared to fight, and prepared to drag Harry out of the classroom if he needed. Hermione's eyes were darting between Harry and the door, as if she were calculating the risks of grabbing him and running out the door. However, they didn't need to. Harry was already halfway out of the door when he realized what he'd done. The sound of his footsteps on the floor echoed through the corridor, only just audible past the blood pounding in his ears. The longer he walked, the more his anger dissipated and turned into panic and frustration. He knew the potion was going to make him reckless, but what he just did was practically suicidal. He expected Hermione or Ron to come after him any minute, and he wasn't sure he could face either of them, so he just kept walking, wanting nothing more than to get as far from the potions classroom as he could. He hadn't told anyone the truth of his home life with the Dursleys, although Ron and Hermione probably had speculations. It wasn't as if he tried to hide it, but no one had ever brought it up in conversation, and with the onset of an actual war, it seemed like a trivial matter. He knew that if he mentioned it, Sirius would help him out and make sure he never had to return to the Dursley household. But he also knew that Sirius would head over to the Dursleys' house to have a word, and Harry didn't want to risk Sirius's freedom. Making a sharp left into an empty classroom on the floor above the dungeon, Harry suddenly felt all his anger, his confusion, his hurt swell inside of him as he slammed the door shut. He quickly cast a muffling charm and began to scream, releasing all of his pent-up magic in the process, smashing a few desks and chairs. He continued to scream in frustration until his throat felt raw and scratchy. It wasn't until he heard a creak from the door hinges that he realized he never locked it.
"Merlin, Potter."
It was Malfoy, which only increased his unstable emotional state.
"Right, well, I don't have a death wish,"
he muttered, pulling the door to, as he hopefully turned to leave. Harry couldn't tell for sure, as he was facing the opposite direction. However, instead of hearing the click of the door closing, Harry heard a sigh.
"This bloody potion,"
Malfoy muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Harry to hear. Harry could hear the door opening again and spun around to see Malfoy standing in the doorframe, looking as if he didn't have a care in the world, but his eyes were filled with concern, a look misplaced on Malfoy's face.
"Potter, I know I'm the last person you will want to see at the moment, but I recommend you talk to someone. Someone who could help you with your unstable state," he said, going to close the door once more.
"Stay," Harry said, despite only moments ago wanting Malfoy to leave. Maybe the potion was somewhat to blame. He saw Malfoy raise an eyebrow and he groaned. I'm not too keen on destroying a classroom, Malfoy.
You'd rather take it out on me then?
Malfoy asked, raising his eyebrow even further.
Potter, did you not hear me when I said I don't?
No, I'll be less likely to destroy anything if someone is around, and I highly doubt anyone else is, Harry explained, running his hand through his hair instinctively. He knew that if Malfoy was the one searching for him, Ron and Hermione had been forced to stay in the classroom, and with everyone else in classes, Malfoy was the only person keeping him from quite literally blowing up the classroom he was in. Malfoy's expression returned to its usual bored demeanor.
I guess if it stops you from killing someone.
He shrugged, closing the door as he stepped into the room. Harry felt another scream bubbling in his throat at the accusation. Now he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop himself from punching Malfoy, much less destroying the classroom. I wouldn't kill anyone, he growled, directing his wand at Malfoy. Malfoy didn't even flinch.
Tell that to those chairs,
he said, gesturing to the splintered remains of a few of the chairs that had exploded.
Accidental magic is dangerous past childhood, Potter. And after what you did in the classroom?
In the classroom? What did I do? He asked. Part of him was hoping he'd done to Snape what he did to Aunt Marge. Malfoy raised an eyebrow.
You didn't notice? You shattered all the glass vials, and a few bottles, too, he said, as if describing the weather. Quite impressive, actually, though
Why are you here? Harry asked, unable to stop himself from interrupting Malfoy. Malfoy stared blankly at Harry, as if he'd been caught red-handed stealing from Snape's personal store cupboard. He sighed before he spoke.
The same reason you are,
he said, and Harry raised his eyebrows, doubtful that Malfoy spent the first 11 years of his life sleeping in a cupboard.
Not the family situation, you nitwit. Drinking the potion.
Harry made an O shape with his mouth. But why would that bring you here?
Because I ran after you, you bloody insufferable git,
Malfoy snapped, his eyes widening as he realized what he'd said, and Harry felt himself blush.
For Merlin's sake, I ran after you to make sure you weren't going to do anything stupid, he explained, rubbing the bridge of his nose.
Harry felt heat rise in his face for multiple reasons. I wouldn't have done anything stupid, he said, frowning at the accusation.
You had just told everyone you sleep in a cupboard. Forgive me if I had doubts,
Malfoy drawled as he leaned against one of the few remaining desks opposite where Harry stood. Now that Malfoy had mentioned running after Harry, he could see a few stray strands of hair, and Harry noticed his robes were noticeably disheveled compared to the last time he'd seen Malfoy. Harry didn't notice he was staring until Malfoy coughed, catching his attention. Malfoy's cheeks were tinged pink. They sat in awkward silence for a few minutes, Harry shifting his weight from foot to foot as Malfoy became very interested in examining the walls. Harry was bewildered by the situation. He was in a classroom with Malfoy after drinking a potion that made him incapable of thinking things through and made his magic just as reckless. The fact that they'd managed to have a half-decent conversation without threatening each other as well, the whole ordeal was bizarre. Aren't you going to ask me about that? Harry asked, watching for Malfoy's reaction. He blinked.
About what?
The cupboard, Harry replied.
I don't expect we'd have the best heart-to-heart, Potter, Malfoy smirked, glancing back at Harry. Besides, would you tell me anything if I did? He returned, raising an eyebrow. Harry found himself smiling. Probably not, he chuckled. I'm surprised you haven't accused me of attention-seeking, though, he said truthfully. He had become so accustomed to people saying that he was elongating the truth, or just flat-out lying, it surprised him when someone didn't. Potter, I'm one of the last people who would accuse you of lying at the moment, Malfoy said, his gaze unshifting from Harry, who furrowed his eyebrows. What do you... Oh, he began, before realizing Malfoy wasn't talking about his outburst in the potions classroom anymore. Thanks, I guess, he said, unsure of what his response should be. He knew what Malfoy was implying. His father was a Death Eater. But what was Harry supposed to say? Sorry your dad's in league with a lunatic who wants to kill me and most of the wizarding world, but thanks for not denying it happening, unlike the Ministry? It was only when Malfoy began to speak again that he realized that's exactly what he did say. You're not the only one who doesn't have the luxury of ignorance, Malfoy sighed, rubbing his temples, as if he could remove the effect of the potion. Salazar, I shouldn't even be talking about this, especially to you, Malfoy said, looking less and less composed by the second.
You don't have to be here, Harry mumbled. In fact, I still don't really understand why you are here, he said skeptically. Malfoy rolled his eyes.
If I was going to kill you, Potter, I'd have done it by now, he drawled, folding his arms.
Doesn't answer the question, Harry pointed out, feeling his heart quicken as a smile appeared on Malfoy's face instead of a sneer. Why would you care if I did something stupid? He asked, and once again Malfoy looked like a deer in headlights.
Believe it or not, Potter, I don't particularly care for my father's ideology, Malfoy said, regaining some of his composure.
Harry stared at Malfoy, his eyes scrutinizing the boy's face for a hint of mistruth. That's not all, is it? Harry stated, blinking as Malfoy froze.
You won't like that answer, he replied.
He was incredibly still, like a statue or a Muggle portrait, displaying a calmness that his eyes betrayed him on as they darted from item to item, anywhere except Harry, who was staring holes into Malfoy as he stood before him. Harry found himself, once again, thinking about how strange this all was. Normally when he had a conversation with Malfoy, one of them said something to piss off the other, and they'd be at each other's throats within seconds. Yet, after taking a befuddlement draught, a potion that rendered the drinker a reckless idiot, their response was to be civilized with each other. It made it seem as if the true impetuous act was for them to become friends. Harry found himself taking a step closer to Malfoy. I want to know, he said, surprised at the lack of ferocity in his voice. He wasn't demanding an answer, but encouraging Malfoy to tell him, something he'd never done, although neither of them needed much encouragement to talk in this state. But Malfoy only said 2 words, one phrase,
"Fuck it,"
before pulling Harry's face to his and connecting their lips, shocking not only Harry but clearly Malfoy himself, who Harry suspected had never made a rash decision in his life. Harry kissed him back. His mind was completely blank, and the only thing he knew in that moment was that he wanted to kiss Malfoy, the pointy git who had been a thorn in his side since day 1. Magic tingled in the air like static, making Harry's hair stand on end as blood rushed to his head, and his heartbeat was so loud he was certain Malfoy could hear it too. Later he would curse himself for being disappointed when Malfoy pulled away. The daunting realization of his kiss with Malfoy must have shown on his face, because Malfoy sighed.
I said you wouldn't like it.
He smiled softly at Harry, his eyes expressing what his face refused to, sorrow. Harry had never been more confused in his life, even more than when he was 11 and he was told he was a wizard. But Malfoy had to add to the confusion.
I hope you appreciate this,
Malfoy said, taking a deep breath.
Don't trust Creature, Harry. There are many blacks he can listen to, and he tends to have a habit of lying to anyone else.
Malfoy smiled fondly at Harry, an expression that made Harry's knees go weak, and lightly brushed his lips on Harry's cheek.
I'm sorry.
With those words, Draco left Harry, gobsmacked, at a loss for words, and alone in a classroom. The effects of the potion were fading, and Harry felt his stomach drop. He had no idea whether the kiss added to his problems or distracted from the chaos he knew he would return to in the common room. The sudden reinstatement of a voice of reason was the only reason why he didn't chase after Malfoy. However, Harry wanted to run after him and kiss him senseless. Or maybe he wanted to yell at Malfoy for kissing him and leaving him without explanation? He was unsure which was more appealing. 20 minutes ago, if someone had told him he would want to kiss Malfoy, it would have sent him into hysterical laughter. Although now, the faint memory his lips had of Malfoy's made his heart skip a beat and his head spin. Add the complication of Malfoy's warning, and he felt as if his head were about to explode. One thing Harry knew for certain, he was going to find out exactly why this just happened.
Harry!
Someone exclaimed as he stepped through the portrait to the Gryffindor common room, practically tackling him to the ground with a hug.
You never came back to the lesson, and Snape, the evil bastard, he wouldn't let us look for you.
Ron, the apparent assailant, explained, talking almost as quickly as Hermione, the worry etched into his face.
Then Malfoy took off, Merlin knows why, and we tried to look for you after class, but decided it's better to wait here for you, and...
Ron's words cut off as he released Harry from his grip.
Harry, why'd you never say anything? Ron asked.
For a brief moment, Harry thought that Ron was offended he had never said anything, but with one look at his friend's face, he noticed that that wasn't it at all. Harry shrugged. It didn't seem important, he said, not wanting to talk about it. I have to talk to you two. I'm so sorry, Harry, Hermione said as Harry dragged the two into the boys' dormitory, which he knew would be empty. You mentioned something before, but I had no idea it was so... Hermione, it's fine, really. I don't want to talk about it, all right? He sighed, the backs of his eyes beginning to ache. Besides, I have to tell you guys what happened after I left. Ron and Hermione exchanged worried glances, and Harry knew they wouldn't leave it alone. But he wasn't in the mood or the right mindset to explain the faults in his childhood, and his mind was preoccupied with a kiss he had just had with a certain blonde. I'll explain it to you some other time. I'm tired, and I'd really like to tell you about what just happened between me and Malfoy, he stressed, hoping that would divert their attention for a bit. And it did.
Malfoy?
Ron exclaimed.
He followed you?
He asked, looking as bewildered as Harry felt. Harry nodded, running his hand through his hair. I was so sure he was going to taunt me, or Merlin, I don't know, try to start a fight, but he didn't, Harry said. His mind was yet to process everything that had happened, and he wasn't sure he wanted it to. He didn't? Hermione asked, as if she thought Harry had misspoken or misheard. Harry shook his head. It was so weird, but he actually had a conversation that didn't make me want to hex the shit out of him. And then he kissed me, and I didn't hate it, he added in his head. But he wasn't sure that was something he should tell either of them. Not only was Harry uncertain of his sexuality, but it was with Malfoy. It must have been the potion, Hermione deduced, and Harry nodded in agreement whilst Ron looked skeptical. It lets you do what you'd normally talk yourself out of. It was definitely something he wouldn't have done without the potion, Harry muttered, still thinking about the kiss, before remembering what it was he actually wanted to talk to Ron and Hermione about. I mean, he kept mentioning that he shouldn't be talking to me, and it was the potion's fault, and then... Harry paused, puzzled by Malfoy's warning. He told me that Creature is loyal to all Blacks, and doesn't have to tell the truth to those he's not loyal to. Ron's face exploded into a ray of emotions until he managed to blurt out, The pointy git mentioned Creature? How would he even... He trailed off, looking questioningly at Hermione, who looked just as concerned. The fact that Malfoy would warn you about Creature is concerning, she said, looking lost in thought. Do you think... She began before whispering. Do you think he knows about Sirius? She asked. I mean, his mother's a Black, Sirius told me, so I'm not surprised he knows Creature exists. Harry looked at Ron and Hermione, who looked at him expectantly. But I don't think it matters if he does, Harry replied, seeing Ron raise his eyebrow in disbelief. Harry then told the two about the rest of the conversation, leaving out anything related to the kiss. He seemed reluctant, maybe scared. Either way, he was doing something he knew could get him in a lot of trouble, and I think it would be the same if the Ministry got involved in his life.
Who would he get in trouble with? Ron asked. His dad? Not the scariest of blokes overall, is he?
Hermione glanced at Harry, scanning his expression. Her eyes widened. You mean, Voldemort? She replied, and Ron's eyes bulged out of his skull.
Merlin, Hermione! Warning, please,
he shivered, before realizing what she just said.
Wait a minute.
He looked at Harry for confirmation, and Harry just sighed. I can't be too sure, but the way he was acting, Voldemort is involved. I know it.